Today is December the 17th. Today we'll look at the plan of salvation as presented by Isaiah. In the book of Isaiah, in the last part, the last half of the book, we've been looking at 4 servant songs. Now, some say there are 5, some throw a passage from Isaiah 61 in, but it's the 4th servant song that stands out for so many of us who are Christians. It actually starts in chapter 52, verse 13. See, my servant will prosper and he'll be highly exalted. But many were amazed when they saw him. His face was so disfigured, he hardly seemed human. From his appearance, one would scarcely know that he was a man. This servant song starts off talking about one who is so beaten and so torn that it's hard to believe that he was a man. In Isaiah 53, picking up again in verse 3, he was despised. He was rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest griefs. We turned our backs on him and looked the other way. He was despised, and we did not care. This servant was rejected, even rejected by those who followed him. Looking back at this now, from our understanding of the life of Jesus, we can actually put times and dates to these events when his disciples ran away from him in the Garden of Gethsemane rather than standing by him and being arrested with him. In verse 4, yet it was our weaknesses he carried. It was our sorrows that weighed him down. We thought his troubles were a punishment from God, a punishment for his own sins, but he was pierced for our rebellion, crushed for our sins. He was beaten so we could be whole. He was whipped so we could be healed. In a very clear way, Isaiah says, he was suffering not for his own sin, but for ours. He took on himself our sin and was punished for sins that he never committed. In verse 6, all we like sheep have strayed away. We have left God's path to follow our own, yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all. Here again, we're sheep. We've wandered. And the Lord lays on the great shepherd the sin of the sheep. He was oppressed and treated harshly, yet he never said a word. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep is silent before the shearers, he did not open his mouth. Unjustly condemned, he was led away. No one cared that he died without descendants, that his life was cut short in midstream, but he was struck down for the rebellion of my people. He had done no wrong. He had never deceived anyone, but he was buried like a criminal. He was put in a rich man's grave. So the Messiah, the suffering servant who is to come, is treated harshly, mistreated for us. He takes on himself our sin, and then he is killed for that sin. Surprisingly buried in a rich man's grave. Picking up now in verse 10. But it was God's good plan to crush him, to cause him grief. Yet when his life is made an offering for sin, he will have many descendants, and he will enjoy a long life. And the Lord's good plan will prosper in his hands. In this very confusing verse, he dies by God's plan, and yet he enjoys a long life by God's plan. How can both be true? Only if the dead returns to life. And so we end in verse 11. When he sees all that is accomplished by his anguish, he will be satisfied. Because of his experience, my righteous servant will make it possible for many to be counted as righteous, for he will bear all their sins. Isaiah clearly says that he takes on himself our sins. He himself was righteous. We were not. And yet he takes on himself our rebellions, our transgressions, our sins. And through him, we are counted as righteous. He finishes chapter 53 with this verse. I'll give him the honors of a victorious soldier because he exposed himself to death. He was counted among the rebels. He bore the sins of many and interceded for the rebels. It's hard to believe that this chapter occurs in the Old Testament. It is so New Testament in its message. Jesus died for our sin. He took on himself our sin, and carrying our sin, he gives us his righteousness. What about you today? Have you accepted his gift of righteousness? If you haven't, take time today to look to him and say, thank you for dying and living for me. Take my sin. Count me as righteous. Like, follow, and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you used to listen to it. We'll see you in church on Sunday.